Welcome back to Employment Law After Hours. Today we're flipping the script from our last episode that talked about Kamala Harris, and now we're talking about what we can expect in a world of employment law if Donald Trump wins the presidency in 2024. His previous term was marked by significant deregulation and a pro-business stance. Will it be more of the same? Let's take a look. Now, at the outset, unlike the Harris campaign, Trump's campaign has very little information on its official website with proposals for labor and employment initiatives. In fact, his website only states tax cut for workers as the sole mention of employee or worker on his official policy platform. Now, his campaign website does cite to a secondary document, presumably the 2024 GOP platform agenda. This document also does not contain any real proposals for labor and employment, other than to broadly state that there needs to be a raise in wages for American workers without any further explanation of how that might come about. An employee is only mentioned twice, one of which is to, quote, fire corrupt employees, end quote, without any additional context. And the second mention of employee is to, quote, hold accountable poorly performing employees who are not giving our veterans the care they deserve, end quote. The word employer isn't stated at all. It's no secret that the Republican Party has largely embraced Project 2025 and its agenda, including Trump, who only recently has tried to distance himself from it. For this reason, we also reviewed Project 2025's agenda for mentions of issues pertaining to labor and employment. Project 2025's policy agenda has a section for the Department of Labor, which is found under Chapter 18 and is approximately 36 pages long. It is no secret that Project 2025 is primarily filled with uninformed proposals that could not possibly be implemented by the president alone without infringing on existing federal law or otherwise usurping the independent authority of businesses. For this reason, we're only going to focus on a few proposals that they might otherwise be able to push through with the president's initiatives alone. We're going to start with deregulation and business-friendly policies that might be employed. One of the key elements of Trump's approach to employment law is deregulation. At least that's how it appears. Under a second Trump term, we'd likely see more of the same proposals from his first term, rolling back labor and employment regulations that are perceived as burdensome to businesses. This could mean fewer reporting requirements for companies, fewer worker safety protections under OSHA, and a focus on cutting back wage and hour enforcement by the Department of Labor. One example of this deregulation is found in Project 2025 and calls on the president to eliminate the EEOC's entity reporting, thereby removing safeguards in workforces when it comes to preventing discrimination, whether that be based on religion, such as Christianity, or even on racial minorities. Project 2025 also calls for a change to the FLSA regarding the interpretation of regular rate to mean the number of hours for overtime and how it would be calculated. Project 2025 desires for overtime to be calculated over more than a 1-week period, which is currently used. This proposal, even if it calls for overtime to be calculated over a 1-month period, is expected to result in reduced overtime payments for employees. For example, under this proposal, an employee could work 45 hours in 1 week, earn 5 hours of overtime, but only work 35 hours in the next week, therefore negating that overtime, and instead that employee only earns the same as if they would if they only worked 40 hours in 1 week and 40 hours in the next week. Attempts at deregulation is further found in Project 2025 when it calls for the removal of protections that prevent people under the age of 18, specifically mentioning teenagers, from working in hazardous jobs. Under current law, minors, typically those under the age of 18, are prohibited in working in certain industries that contain jobs or positions that are otherwise deemed hazardous. However, at its roots, Project 2025 isn't necessarily all about deregulation. It also includes additional significant regulation in areas that it feels strongly, including the example of requiring businesses to prohibit the use of a bachelor's degree requirement in job descriptions for private sector employers. Let's now shift to independent contractors and how they're defined under federal law. Trump's prior term largely left gig economy workers classified as independent contractors, giving businesses in this sector more flexibility. A second term could solidify that stance, making it harder for gig workers and independent contractors to seek reclassification as employees. This would limit access to those workers and contractors to benefits like overtime, paid leave, and unemployment insurance. Trump would likely roll back Biden's existing independent contractor rule, making it easier for businesses to classify employees as independent contractors, taking them outside the purview and requirements of the Fair Labor Standards Act and discrimination protections. In fact, this proposal is specifically contained and mentioned in Project 2025. Further, as stated in Project 2025, this policy agenda calls on Trump to do what he can to reverse the Supreme Court's decision interpreting sexual orientation under the definition of sex, thereby removing anti-discrimination protections for sexual orientation, except in the context of hiring and firing. However, Project 2025 does seek to increase the requirements for employers to ensure religious diversity in the workforce, especially with groups that Project 2025 considers to hold traditional beliefs about marriage, gender, and sexuality, primarily interpreted to mean Christianity. Let's now shift to immigration and its impact on employment and employment laws. Trump's prior term was also marked by strict immigration policies, which affected industries that were primarily reliant on immigrant workers. A return to the White House could see a continuation or even expansion of these policies, with stricter requirements for employment-based visas and increased workplace audits by ICE, otherwise known as the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency. Trump has already touted a desire for increased deportations, which could result in employee shortages in certain industries such as agriculture and hospitality, and those that otherwise contain a significant number of immigrant workers. Project 2025 has been interpreted to call for the capping and phase down of the H-2A and H-2B visa program, extremely limiting the number of foreigners who can work in America regardless of their skills or expertise. This could have significant impact on the healthcare industry that largely enjoys the expertise and knowledge of foreigners who can come here to assist with the healthcare industry. Let's now focus for a moment on labor unions. During his first term, Trump's administration appointed more conservative members to the National Labor Relations Board, which is often seen as a political board that ebbs and flows based on the party that occupies the White House. This resulted in a more employer-friendly stance on union matters. In a second term, we could expect continued support for, quote, right-to-work laws and rulings that make unionizing more difficult for workers, as well as returning abilities back to companies to skirt the line when it comes to threats of termination and/or discipline for attempting to unionize. If Trump were to win a second term, we'd likely see a continuation of his business and deregulatory agenda, at least in areas that he feels require deregulation, which could mean fewer protections for workers but more flexibility for employers. Thanks again for tuning into Employment Law After Hours, and if you have not already checked it out, make sure you view our episode covering what a Harris administration might look like from a labor and employment policy standpoint. We recommend that every viewer thoroughly review the policy agendas of both candidates and consider the actual impact of their proposals and make decisions as to whether you believe Project 2025 and Trump's agenda would be right for the American workforce or whether its risks are just too great. If you want to know my predictions for a Harris presidency, please see this video linked on the screen now and below, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more HR business news as the election season continues.